The sun had barely risen when the barking began, sharp, urgent, and coming from the center of the compound. A dozen women bolted upright in their bunks, hearts pounding. Across the yard, beneath the rows of laundry lines and watchtowers, the camp dog, a mottled mutt the Americans called Chopper, was circling a young Japanese prisoner, tail stiff, eyes locked. She froze. Then, slowly, he approached and pressed his head to her thigh. The guards stopped shouting. The women held their breath. One cowboy, leaning against the fence post, removed his hat and said it softly. The dog chose them. No one knew what it meant yet, but within days the camp's quiet order would fracture, and what followed would ripple through every bunkhouse. Chopper had been a joke, a stray that wandered into the Texas camp weeks before, but now something had changed. The dog wouldn't leave her side. And what he did next? None of them, American or Japanese, would ever forget it. From that morning on, the dog was never just a dog again. He had crossed an invisible line, one no prisoner or guard had dared to step over. The next time the women lined up for roll call, the mutt trotted in beside her as though he belonged there, tongue lolling, tail down but alert. The young Japanese nurse didn't look at him. She didn't speak. But when the guards barked her number, she stepped forward, and so did he, standing firm beside her as if the two of them had rehearsed it. The line of women broke into murmurs. One covered her mouth in disbelief. The guards exchanged glances. No one stopped it. No one quite knew how. Her name was never spoken aloud by the Americans, and only once whispered between the women. Shira. Whether that was her name or something given to her after the surrender, no one was sure. She had come off the convoy from the Pacific with the others, nurses, signal clerks, radio assistants, the last fragments of a shattered island command. Her uniform was bloodied, not by battle, but by exhaustion. She'd been pulled from a field tent in Saipan, barely conscious, half-starved, still wearing the armband of a medical auxiliary. She had not cried, not screamed, not even blinked when loaded onto the hospital transport. One of the medics later remarked that she looked like a ghost, still deciding whether to haunt the living or pass on. In the barracks, Shira kept to herself. She sat with her back to the wall, never facing the door. She moved as if always waiting for someone to strike her. She refused bread the first day, touched nothing sweet, and flinched at every loud voice. The other women didn't speak to her much. Some thought she was a fanatic, clinging to the Bushido code even now. Others thought her simply broken. Then the dog came. He wasn't military, he wasn't trained, just a desert stray that wandered into the camp one morning, ribs showing, eyes sharp. The Americans called him Chopper. No one knew why. He had a crooked tail, one ear that didn't stand up, and a slow, confident way of trotting around like he owned the dirt. At first, the guards tried to chase him out. Then they ignored him. Then they started feeding him scraps. By the end of the month, he was the camp's unofficial mascot. They said he was the sheriff now. He watched everything. He liked biscuits. He hated the cook. But something changed the day he chose Shira. No one saw it happen. One moment the dog was sniffing around the latrines. The next, he was standing in front of her like a statue, tail still, ears forward. The other women backed away. Shira did not. She stared at him. He stared back. And then, slowly, he stepped forward, pressed his head to her leg, and lay down at her feet. From then on, they were inseparable. He followed her everywhere. Kitchen duty, laundry lines, roll call. When she moved, he moved. When she sat, he curled beside her. When she was ordered to scrub the barrack floors, he lay in the hallway, silent, watching. Guards joked that maybe she smelled like meat. Others said it was witchcraft. But the older cowboy, the one with the slow drawl and the quiet way of leaning against things, just said, "The dog chose her, that's all." And that's all it took. The reaction among the women was more complicated. To be followed, protected, shadowed by a dog, a creature considered unclean in traditional Japanese culture, was not just strange, it was jarring. Some saw it as shameful, as if Shira had surrendered to something even lower than the enemy. Others watched with envy, aching for that kind of quiet devotion. Shira, for her part, never reached for him, never stroked his fur or fed him openly, but she allowed him near, and that in itself was unthinkable, because in the world she came from, loyalty was offered only upward, to command, to nation, to emperor, not sideways, not to something that slept in the dirt and begged for scraps. And yet there he was. One evening, as the women scrubbed laundry under the pump, a young guard approached too fast, shouting at the line. Shira stepped back. The dog stepped forward. No bark, no snarl, just a hard, silent stance. The guard stopped cold. The others saw it. No one spoke. But the tension shifted. The rules had cracked. That night the dog curled beneath Shira's bunk like always. Rain fell soft against the tin roof. The other women listened to it and to the steady sound of Chopper's breath. No one slept easily, but for the first time in weeks, Shira did. And the dog did not move. Part 2. No one taught him that. The next morning he wasn't at the mess hall. That was the first thing the guards noticed. He'd spent weeks curling up near the cookhouse fire, licking grease tins clean, stealing biscuits when no one was looking. But now the sheriff of the camp was missing from his post. Instead, they found him pacing along the laundry line, ears pricked, eyes watchful, as Shira wrung a pair of soaked undergarments beneath the cotton sun. When she moved to the drying rack, he followed. When she turned to fetch a new load, he sat again, a silent sentinel in the dust. A guard gave a whistle, sharp, practiced, the kind that would call any ranch dog in Texas. Chopper didn't flinch. "Damn mutt's gone rogue," someone muttered. But not all thought so. To the old cowboys in uniform, the ones who had broken horses and raised cattle before they ever wore a rifle, there was something about it that made sense. They didn't use leashes back home. You didn't train a real dog. You earned him. You didn't command loyalty. You proved yourself worthy of it. And when a dog made his choice, there was no talking him out of it. One sergeant, once a ranch hand near Amarillo, said it plain. "Ain't no trick. That dog just decided. Don't mean he's wrong." Others weren't so sure. By the end of the week, Chopper was a walking problem. He refused to leave the Japanese quarters. He growled at the kitchen staff when they barked orders at the women. One morning he followed Shira into the storage shed, and when a corporal tried to shoo him away with a broom, he bared his teeth, full, white, and silent. The corporal backed out, white-faced. The commandant was furious. "It's a damn dog," he snapped during lunch. "Put it on a chain or shoot it." But no one moved. The guards had started placing bets. How long could the dog go before getting someone fired? Or worse, saluted? Then came the incident. It was a late afternoon inspection. The sun had dropped behind the far cottonwoods, casting long shadows across the parade yard. The Japanese women stood in lines, backs straight, hands folded behind them. Most stared at the dirt. Shira was near the end of the third row, eyes forward, unmoving. A new sergeant, young, nervous, and already sweating through his uniform, was running the checks. His voice cracked as he barked questions none of the women understood. Frustrated, he moved faster, tapping the end of his rifle on boots, motioning to step forward, then back. When he got to Shira, something shifted. She didn't move fast enough, or maybe she didn't understand. The sergeant raised his voice. Then he raised his hand. That's when Chopper stepped in. He had been lying a few yards away under the water tower, head down like he was asleep. But before the guard's hand even reached her shoulder, the dog was between them. No growl this time, just a stance. Shoulders squared, teeth visible, the sound of the entire yard breathing in. No one moved, no one said a word. The sergeant froze, hand still raised in the air. The dog didn't bark. He didn't charge. He just stood there like a wall built of fur and silence and something older than war. The officer in charge watched from the shade. He gave no order. The inspection moved on. That night, the guards whispered about it in the mess tent. He's guarding her like he's paid to. She trained him somehow. It ain't natural. But even the ones who laughed did so quietly. Something had changed. A line had been drawn, and not by the prisoners. Later, as the floodlights flicked on and the camp settled into its usual rhythm of night patrols and mosquito bites, Chopper took his place beneath her bunk. His eyes remained open. The guards walked slower past her barracks now. No one said why. And when the wind picked up that evening, lifting the dust off the Texas soil, it carried with it a new kind of silence, one shaped not by fear, but by something closer to respect. Part 3. A Dog Between Two Empires. The next morning, Shira didn't wait for the dog to follow her. She stood, stepped lightly over the sleeping forms of the other women, and paused by the barrack door. She turned her head, just slightly, and said something under her breath. A word so soft the others barely caught it. The dog's ears twitched. He rose, stretched once, and trotted after her. Some swore he had nodded. The name she had whispered was Kuma. In Japanese it meant bear, though her family's hunting dog had been anything but. He was small, wiry, alert, an Akita mix trained to flush birds from bamboo groves near their summer home outside Sendai. She had been a girl then, barely old enough to hold a leash, and yet the dog had always returned to her. Even when her older brother called, it was Shira he ran to. On quiet nights, before war became every conversation, she would curl next to Kuma on the porch and whisper stories into his fur. That dog had been her first secret. She hadn't thought of him in years. The day the military truck came to take the women for auxiliary duty, Kuma had barked and chased after them. A soldier kicked him away. She wasn't allowed to look back. Weeks later, in the jungle of Saipan, surrounded by blood and heat and the screams of dying men, she had closed her eyes and tried to remember how Kuma's fur felt beneath her hand, but even that had faded. Until now, until this dog, no leash, no command, just presence, just choice. But Shira wasn't the only one carrying ghosts. One of the American guards, a corporal from Iowa named Jessup, had taken to watching Chopper from the far edge of the yard. He didn't laugh when the dog ignored whistles. He didn't joke when the prisoners slipped scraps to him behind the laundry line. Instead, he wrote. In long, quiet stretches between his rounds, he sat at the edge of the canteen porch, pencil in hand, notebook resting on one knee. It was for his brother. He told no one. But the truth was, he was writing to a dog. Dear Rex, one page began, the new mutt at camp don't look a thing like you. But sometimes, when he sits still and watches the way you used to on patrol, I swear it's your eyes. Jessup had served in Italy, Monte Cassino, where mud swallowed boots and bullets fell like rain. Rex had been his K9 partner, a massive German shepherd trained to sniff out mines and wounded men. He had saved 6 lives before the mortar took him. Jessup had carried what was left of him off the ridge with one hand over his heart, and when he returned to stateside, he kept the collar. Now, in Texas, watching Chopper curl up beside a Japanese prisoner, that same ache twisted in his chest. Not because he saw betrayal, but because he saw something true. The kind of loyalty that didn't care for sides or flags. That evening, as the sun bled red over the horizon, Shira stood by the fence with the dog beside her. She crouched slowly, knees to dirt, and placed her hand gently on Chopper's back. She didn't pet him, not exactly. Just let her fingers rest there like she was trying to remember something from another life. Then, without looking around, she whispered the name again, Kuma. The dog's ears perked. He turned to her. There was no wag, no bark, just recognition, a silence between them that felt heavier than any words. In that moment, the line between nations blurred. The women who watched from behind the barracks fell silent. The guards along the wire shifted in place, but said nothing. Even the wind seemed to hush, as if the Texas plains themselves understood that something sacred had passed between them. Not claimed by the Japanese, not claimed by the Americans. The dog had chosen, yes, but not a side. He walked between empires now, and neither could call him theirs. Part 4. The Storm and the Standoff. That afternoon, the sky changed color. Thick clouds boiled over the horizon, low and metallic, and the wind began to swirl in heavy gusts that lifted grit from the earth and lashed it sideways across the compound. Men and women alike looked upward. A Texas storm was coming, and even those born under its skies moved faster. The guards shouted for the women to return to barracks. Laundry lines snapped. Loose tin clattered from the shed roof. A flagpole groaned. The first crack of thunder sounded like artillery. Shira flinched. Rain came in sheets, fast and blinding. It turned the dust to paste, then to puddles. Water poured off the barrack roofs in dirty rivers, and lightning lit the yard in jagged bursts. Power flickered, then died. The fence lights sputtered once and went black. For the first time since they'd arrived, the camp felt like a different world. Lawless, shadowed, brittle. Inside Barracks 3, the women huddled in silence. Candlelight danced on the wooden walls, casting long, trembling shadows. Some prayed, others stared at the door, and then it opened. The guard who stumbled in wasn't on duty. His uniform was soaked, shirt half untucked, belt loose. He reeked of bourbon and fury. His eyes were glassy, but his anger was sharp. No one moved, no one dared. He kicked a bucket across the floor. "Get up," he barked, though it wasn't clear at who. "You think this is a hotel?" The women remained still, unsure whether to obey or disappear. Water dripped from the man's cap. His face twisted. He pointed to a young woman near the back and shouted again. She tried to rise, hands trembling, but slipped on the wet floorboards. Laughter, sharp, ugly, spilled from the man's mouth. Behind him, thunder roared again. The door slammed shut from the wind, and in that sudden quiet there was a new sound, a growl, low, cold, unmistakable. The guard turned. Chopper stood near the back of the room, just in front of Shira's bunk. His body was stiff, tail straight, ears forward. His eyes locked on the man, unblinking. Water matted his fur to his ribs, and his lips peeled back slowly from his teeth. The guard laughed again, but it cracked in his throat. "You again?" he slurred. "Filthy mutt! I'll—" He reached forward. The bite wasn't a lunge. It wasn't wild or frenzied. It was fast, precise, measured. Teeth met flesh just below the wrist. The man yelped and stumbled backward, clutching his arm. Blood mixed with rainwater on the floor. The women gasped, pressed against the walls. Chopper did not move. He simply stared, his jaw now closed, chest heaving once. The drunk guard staggered to the door, muttering curses, one hand cradling the wound. He vanished into the storm. The door slammed behind him. No one followed. No one spoke. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain hammering the tin roof and Chopper's breath in the darkness. Then Shira stood. She stepped forward, past the others, past the blood, and placed her hand on the dog's back. Not a command, not a gesture of control, just contact, like a grounding wire. And Chopper sat. That night, as lightning rippled across the sky and the guards scrambled to restore power, no one spoke of what had happened. But word spread quickly. A prisoner had been attacked. A dog had defended her. And no one, not even the officers, was sure what the protocol for that was. But something had shifted. The next morning, the yard smelled of mud and ozone. The power was back, but something else had shorted out in the camp. Rules bent, hierarchies cracked, and at the center of it, padding silently behind a woman who never asked for protection, walked the one creature who had obeyed no one and chosen everything. Part 5. That's No Japanese Dog. By sunrise, the gates to the supply shed were locked, and Chopper was inside them. Someone had looped a chain through the handles and snapped a padlock shut. A tin bowl of water had been slid under the door. The dog didn't bark. He didn't whimper. But when the Japanese women filed past for morning inspection, they could hear his claws scraping gently on the wood, just once, like the whisper of a question. Why? No one answered. Word of the bite had spread faster than any official report. Half the guards said it was justified. The man had been drunk. He'd crossed a line. The other half didn't care. A dog had attacked a United States Army staff member. Protocol demanded response, orders, consequences. Should have shot it on the spot, one guard muttered behind the mess tent. But not everyone agreed. That ain't no Japanese dog, another snapped, the same one who'd once called Chopper sheriff. That's a Texas dog. Just don't like cowards. Inside the women's barracks, something unexpected was brewing. No orders were given, no words passed in command. But after the dog disappeared behind that locked door, a silence settled over the compound, and then it deepened. At breakfast, trays were left untouched. At work assignments, hands hung limp at sides. By noon, not a single Japanese prisoner had moved. The guards thought it was fear, or perhaps illness. But when the officer in charge approached one of the translators, she said it flatly, "No food, no work until dog-free." At first the Americans laughed, but the laughter faded quickly when it didn't break. Hour by hour the lines held. No sweeping, no laundry, no kitchen help. Women sat cross-legged in the dirt, backs straight, eyes ahead. No shouting moved them, no threats stirred them. It was the first time since their arrival that they acted not as survivors, but as something far more dangerous, a group with purpose. And it wasn't for honor, it wasn't for nation, it was for a dog. Inside the canteen that evening, the officers argued. The guards were split down the middle. "He's just a damn mutt, not worth the trouble. You put him down, the whole camp turns. You'll have a real problem on your hands. He bit a soldier. He stopped a drunk from beating a prisoner." The conversation spun, round and bitter. But outside, beneath the pale Texas sky, the women did not move. One of them, an older woman who had rarely spoken, sat by the chain-linked shed and sang a song in a broken whisper. It wasn't in Japanese, it wasn't in English. Just soft syllables meant more for the animal inside than for anyone else. That night, Shira was brought before the officers. They demanded she explain herself. Why the strike? Why the silence? Why a dog? She stood silent for a long time, staring at the floor. Her hands were still, her face unreadable. Then, in halting English, she raised her eyes and said, "He protect, he no enemy." The room fell quiet. No one had heard her speak in English before. Perhaps she had been listening all along, or perhaps it was the only sentence she could manage, but it was enough. Outside, the wind stirred. Someone unlocked the shed after dark, when most had gone to sleep. The door creaked open. Chopper stepped out slowly, sniffed the air once, and then trotted toward the barracks like he'd simply been late for dinner. No fanfare, no apology, just silence. But by morning, the women were working again, and the dog, uncollared, unchained, and unclaimed, was back at her side. Part 6. The Trial in the Canteen. By the end of the week, someone decided it couldn't be ignored. A formal report had been filed about the incident with the drunk guard. Washington would want records. The Geneva inspectors might ask questions. So a meeting was called, not in the commandant's office or any official courtroom, but in the camp's mess canteen, where long wooden tables still held the smell of burned coffee and overboiled cabbage. It wasn't called a trial. That would sound ridiculous on paper, but that's what it was. A tribunal, they said. A disciplinary review. A hearing. No lawyers, no jury, just 4 officers, 2 sergeants, a chaplain, and a translator seated around the mess hall's largest table. On one side, the bitten guard, his wrist wrapped in gauze and pride leaking from every pore. On the other, a handful of enlisted men, mostly cowboys turned soldiers, who refused to let the matter slide quietly under the wire. Outside, the camp carried on as if unaware. But everyone knew. Chopper was absent, confined again, though not to the shed. This time it was a wire crate in the back of the garage, an old army cage meant for gear, not for life. The dog didn't whine, didn't snap, but when the canteen door creaked open and the meeting began, he let out a single sound. A howl, long, low, and almost human. Every woman in Barracks 3 froze. The absurdity of it struck even the officers. They were discussing punishments, reprimands, euthanasia, over a dog. But the weight in the room made it feel heavier than that. It wasn't about teeth or protocol anymore. It was about something unspoken, something no regulation covered. One lieutenant, trying to steer things back to logic, repeated, "He bit a U.S. Army guard." "He also stopped a drunk from hitting a prisoner," replied another. "He was following instincts." "Maybe," muttered the older cowboy, leaning against the wall, arms folded. "Or maybe he was doing what none of us did." The chaplain, silent until now, finally spoke. "We can't afford to make this a symbol." But it already was. Back in the barracks, the Japanese women argued too, quietly, in low voices over folded blankets and mess tin lids. Some said the dog was a distraction, something dangerous. They feared punishment, retaliation. Others sat in silence, eyes wet, staring at the floor. A few had placed small offerings outside the shed where Chopper had last slept. Half a roll, a strip of cloth. One even left a folded paper crane. One woman, older than most, whispered to the camp chaplain during his rounds that she no longer knew who the enemy was. "If the dog is theirs," she said, "then what does that make us?" Back in the canteen, the cowboy finally stepped forward. Dust still clung to his boots. His voice was soft, almost apologetic. "That dog don't belong to us anymore," he said. "He's theirs now. Ain't never seen loyalty cross a line like that. Maybe we ought to let it." There was no vote, no gavel. The commandant sighed. "File it as no action taken," he muttered. Muzzle him if it makes you feel better." It didn't. When the crate was opened, Chopper didn't bolt. He stepped out slow, tail low, but steady. One of the guards extended a leash. The dog walked past it, straight toward the women's side of the compound. He didn't pause. He didn't look back. And from her place by the water pump, Shira stood without being called. She said nothing, just waited. By the time the sun dipped below the guard towers, the trial that wasn't a trial had ended. Nothing was written on the record. But in every mouth that repeated the story, from the chow line to the laundry station, the verdict was clear. He'd chosen his side, and so had they. Part 7. The Day the Wire. Opened. By dawn the next morning, the camp felt different. Lighter in some places, tense in others, as though the very air was waiting for someone to make the next move. Chopper had slept outside the women's barracks, curled against the wall beneath Shira's window as if keeping watch. The guards saw him when they began their rounds, but none tried to chase him off. No one wanted to be the first to stir the embers of what had nearly become a firestorm. It was mid-morning when it happened. The cowboy who had spoken up during the hearing, hat pulled low, boots dust-stained, eyes half-closed against the glare, walked across the yard with a slow, deliberate gait. He didn't look at anyone. Not the guards, not the prisoners, not even at Chopper. Instead, he headed behind the vehicle shed, where the crate still sat open from the night before, the chain hanging loose like a question left unanswered. He reached down and unlatched the last clasp still hooked through the mesh. It clicked softly, a sound small enough to be swallowed by the wind, yet somehow every guard who happened to glance over seemed to hear it. When the door swung free, he stepped back and waited. Chopper didn't leap out, didn't sprint, didn't bark. He simply stepped forward with the same steady certainty he had shown the day he first pressed his head against Shira's leg. His paws touched the dirt, one after the other, slow and sure. And then he lifted his head. Across the yard, past the laundry posts, past the guard tower's shadow, past the rows of watching faces, stood Shira. She wasn't working, she wasn't speaking, she wasn't even moving. She stood like a statue carved out of stillness, but something in her posture, upright yet trembling, made every pair of eyes shift between her and the dog. Then Chopper began to walk, not trot, not wander, walk. A straight line through the dust, as if the earth itself had laid a path the night before. The prisoners saw it first. A few gasped. One woman covered her mouth. Another whispered a prayer out of habit rather than faith. The guards stiffened, unsure whether to call out or hold their breath. The dog reached her. Shira lowered her gaze, not in fear, but in something older, deeper. Chopper sniffed her hand once, then lifted it with his nose. When she didn't pull away, he licked her fingers gently, like greeting a packmate who had been gone too long. Then he sat at her feet. The yard went silent. It wasn't obedience. It wasn't training. It was recognition, a reunion, a choice reaffirmed. And something inside the camp's emotional scaffolding, built on routine, regulation, and unspoken walls, shifted. Shira did something no prisoner had done in months. Something forbidden by protocol and unthinkable under the weight of military discipline. She stepped away from the line, walked directly to the cowboy who had opened the crate, and bowed. Deeply. Not a nod, not a polite dip. A full, formal bow of gratitude that broke every rule of distance between captor and captive. The cowboy froze. His face reddened. He tilted back slightly as if embarrassed by a gesture too heavy for him to hold. He lifted his hands, unsure whether to wave her off or acknowledge it. "Ma'am," he muttered, the only word he could manage. The other guards didn't laugh, didn't scold. They only exchanged looks, some confused, some irritated, some contemplative. One of them murmured, "Well, hell, what do we do now?" But no one answered. The women watched too, not with fear this time, nor suspicion, but with something closer to awe. One leaned toward another and whispered, "He came back for her." Another shook her head. "No, he never left." Shira returned to her place in line, the dog padding beside her with quiet authority. The guards didn't try to move him. The sergeant who had been bitten kept his distance, rubbing his bandaged hand like someone remembering a lesson learned the hard way. It was a moment without orders, without explanation, without precedent. But everyone in the yard, American and Japanese, felt it. The line between prisoner and protector had blurred. The line between rules and instinct had cracked. And the line around the dog, the one they had tried to draw with chains and discipline, had dissolved completely. Chopper hadn't slipped the wire. He had changed what it meant. And as the morning sun rose higher, warming the dust and stretching shadows across the yard, a quiet understanding settled over the camp. Control had not been lost. Something stronger had been found. Part 8. What the dog did next. The next night, Chopper didn't sleep outside the barracks. He slept inside. No one invited him. No one gave permission. He waited until the last bedrolls were unrolled, until the lanterns were dimmed, and then he padded through the open doorway as if it had always been his place. He curled up at the far end, near Shira's bunk, his body coiled tight but alert, his ears twitching at the creak of footsteps or distant guard calls. By morning, half the women had unconsciously shifted their sleeping positions to face him. The guards noticed. But they said nothing. In the days that followed, the dog became part of the rhythm of the camp, but not the military one. He woke when the women woke. He followed them to roll call, flanked them as they walked to the mess, and settled at the base of the laundry post like a stone marker from some old shrine. When one of the women brushed his back with an old wooden comb they had fashioned from a spoon handle, he didn't resist. When another told a story in low Japanese, the kind with ghosts and forests and lost children, Chopper blinked slowly, his head resting on crossed paws. And the women smiled. Not all at once, not constantly. But they smiled. The change was subtle. But to the guards who had spent months watching these women move like shadows through heat and barbed wire, it was unmistakable. Laughter, real, unscripted laughter, was heard from Barracks 3 for the first time. One woman began braiding another's hair again. Someone started humming during kitchen duty. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't hope. It was something older, something human. One afternoon, a young prisoner, barely 20, her uniform hanging off a frame thinned by grief, sat in the corner with her face buried in her knees. She had received a letter, or hadn't, no one knew. But she didn't eat, didn't speak, just wept silently. Chopper walked to her, lay down, and placed his head across her foot. She didn't move. For nearly an hour, he stayed like that, his breath rising and falling against her ankle. When she finally reached out and touched his fur, her hand trembled, but didn't pull away. Later that evening, when the women gathered to fold linen, she was among them, still quiet, but present. The guards watched from the tower. One of them, an older private who had lost 2 brothers in the Pacific, came down after his shift and walked to the supply tent where leftover scraps were stored. He picked through the cooled trays and found a piece of roasted chicken. Instead of tossing it in with the garbage, he wrapped it in wax paper, walked across the compound, and handed it, wordlessly, to the woman who had once said, He no enemy. She blinked at him, startled, then stepped back and gave the meat to Chopper. The guard nodded and walked away. No order had been given. No regulations changed. But something was shifting. Even the Cowboys, who had once called Chopper a nuisance, began referring to him differently. "That old boy's got more sense than most men," one said. "He don't see uniforms," said another. "Just pain, and who's trying to stop it?" That night, Chopper circled the bunks once before, lying down. Not at Shira's feet this time, but between two younger women who had started telling stories again. He sighed, deep and content, and the women tucked their blankets tighter, not to guard themselves from the cold, but to create a pocket of warmth around him. A kind of circle, a kind of peace. If you're moved by this story, please give the video a like and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We love hearing your stories. Part 9, His Final March. The news came before sunrise, delivered on a thin stack of papers, and a single hard knock on the commandant's door. The Japanese prisoners were being transferred. New camp, new command, new procedures. It was written plainly, clinically, as if the order were nothing more than a change in weather. But for the women, it felt like the ground tilting beneath them. They were told to pack their belongings, what little they had: a blanket, a tin cup, a spare shirt, clean socks if they were lucky. Some of them had been here long enough to grow accustomed to the rhythm, the safety, the strange, unexpected pockets of humanity. Now the rhythm would be broken. And there was one more rule, spoken sharply by an officer who didn't look anyone in the eye. The dog stays. It went through the barracks like a ripple. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered no. Shira didn't speak at all. She simply looked down at Chopper, who was already standing, sensing the shift in the air. His tail didn't wag. His ears didn't lift. He only pressed his head against her knee as if anchoring her in place. By the time the women were marched toward the trucks, the sky still pale with morning, Chopper was pacing the length of the yard, back and forth, tail low, steps quick. A guard tossed him a scrap of bacon, but he didn't touch it. He watched the women boarding, eyes fixed on Shira as though afraid the world would turn inside out if he blinked. When roll call ended and the truck's engines rumbled to life, he made his decision. He bolted. He slipped under the rope line, dodged a startled corporal, and shot toward the loading ramp with a speed none of them had seen before. A cry rose from the women, sharp, almost like a warning, but Chopper didn't need one. He leapt and landed beside the rear tire of the first bus, panting, stubborn, shaking with adrenaline. A guard cursed and tried to grab him. Chopper darted away. The trucks began to roll forward. He followed, and then he ran. Dust exploded beneath his paws as he chased the convoy down the long dirt road that cut through the camp's boundary. The women inside pressed their faces to the slatted windows, shouting his name in a dozen broken accents, some calling him Kuma, others Chopper, one simply crying out, "Please." Shira gripped the window bars until her fingers numbed. The dog did not stop. He kept pace through the turns, through the gates, through the long stretch where the guard towers grew smaller behind him. The ground was rough, littered with stones. His back legs slipped more than once, but he surged forward again, panting clouds through the warm Texas dawn. The women were crying openly now, hands over mouths, shoulders shaking. One shouted to the guards to stop. Another begged in English. Shira didn't beg. She leaned out as far as she dared and whispered the one name the dog had always understood. "Kuma." He heard her. His pace quickened, even as blood began to appear on the pads of his paws. A sergeant riding shotgun banged on the roof of the cab. "Sir, we can't have a dog chasing a military convoy." "Then stop the damn truck," one of the cowboys snapped from the back. "He'll run himself dead." The officer hesitated, torn between regulation and the sight unfolding in the mirror. A dog choosing a fate no order could dictate. Finally, the command came. "Stop!" Brakes hissed. The buses slowed. The dust settled around them like a soft curtain. Chopper stumbled the last few steps, sides heaving, legs trembling. He reached the rear wheel and collapsed onto his belly, tongue lolling, but eyes locked on Shira. The cowboy climbed down first. He walked toward the dog, crouched beside him, and ran a hand over the bloodied fur of his paws. Then he stood, met the sergeant's stare, and said the sentence that had become truth long before they admitted it aloud. "The dog made his choice." The sergeant looked at the convoy orders, then at the animal lying stubbornly in the dirt. With a sigh heavy enough to bend metal, he took out his pencil and scribbled a line at the bottom of the page. "Authorized animal escort. 1. Chopper lifted his head. The women cheered. Shira's eyes filled. And as the cowboy picked the dog up gently, carefully, reverently, and carried him into the bus, the camp they left behind seemed suddenly much farther away than the miles between them. Part 10. The Monument Beneath the Tree. The old road had mostly disappeared. What was once a gravel path through scrubland was now overgrown with mesquite and wild thistle, the Texas wind carving the horizon into something shapeless and new. A rusted fence post leaned sideways beneath a cottonwood tree, its wire long gone. The land didn't remember boundaries anymore, but she did. Shira stood at the edge of what used to be the main gate, her shoes crunching over broken stone and memory. The year was 1967. She was no longer young. Her hair, once raven black, now brushed her shoulders in strands of gray and white. She wore a light coat, even though the sun was warm. Her fingers trembled slightly as they clutched the photo in her pocket, the only one ever taken during those years. It showed nothing remarkable, just a line of women folding laundry, and a dog asleep at their feet. She had spent years wondering if the place would still exist, if anyone would remember. Most of the camp had been dismantled by the 50s, torn down for farmland, paved over in parts, forgotten in others. But one tree had remained. She recognized it immediately, the one that used to cast a long shadow across the barracks at dusk, the one where the dog had used to curl up and watch the guards walk their loops, and beneath it something waited, a wooden post, short, hand-cut, weathered with time, nearly swallowed by the brush, but not quite. Someone had carved into it, not a soldier, not a government, just a hand with time and love and something that refused to be erased. It read, "Chopper, camp dog. He chose them." The words were crooked, uneven, letters faded in places, but she saw them clearly as if they'd been written just yesterday. Her knees gave way before her mind could stop them, and she knelt in the dry grass, pressing her palm to the marker's face. "Arigato," she whispered. "Thank you." The wind moved softly around her, rustling the brittle weeds. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she could hear it again. Not the sound of war or hunger or the echo of boots, but the steady breathing of the dog who had once curled beside her during the nights when she didn't know if she would survive the next. She didn't speak for a long time. There had never been medals, no ceremony, no grave with flag and folded cloth. But this small, hand-carved sign, meant more than all of that. It was not a monument to victory or defeat. It was a monument to choice, to a creature who had no orders, no loyalty stamped into his collar, and still chose to stay, to protect, to belong. In a world defined by sides, he had walked between them and shown what it meant to stand for something deeper. She placed the photo at the base of the post, weighed it down with a small stone, not for others to find, just so it wouldn't blow away, just so someone else, someday, might kneel here too and wonder why a dog's name had been carved into the bones of Texas. When she rose, her knees ached, her eyes were wet, but her heart, somehow, felt lighter than it had in years. "You taught us more than war ever did," she said, her voice barely more than breath. Then she turned and walked back toward the car, leaving the wind to guard what was left. If this story stayed with you, please give the video a like and drop a comment below saying where you're tuning in from. Your voices help us keep these forgotten stories alive.